Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. I found myself thinking about something that I don't think enough people are talking about. Everybody keeps asking whether Mayday can bring down Gilead. It's a fair question. After all, Mayday has been one of the most important forces in this universe for years. We've heard about them in the Handmaid's Tale. We've seen their influence. We've seen the fear they create inside Gilead. And now in the Testaments we're finally seeing just how deeply connected they are to the story. But the more I thought about it, the more I started wondering if we're asking the wrong question. Because what if the real question isn't whether Mayday can destroy Gilead? What if the real question is whether Gilead is already destroying itself? No, seriously. Think about everything we've seen so far. The more you look at Season 1, the less it feels like we're watching the beginning of a rebellion. Instead, it feels like we're watching the final stage of one. And that's what makes Mayday so interesting. Because I don't think Mayday's greatest weapon is what most people think it is. I don't think it's spies. I don't think it's secret missions. I don't think it's smuggling operations. I think it's something much bigger. I think Mayday's greatest weapon is the fact that Gilead is slowly becoming trapped by its own contradictions. One of the biggest mistakes people make when thinking about Mayday is imagining it as a traditional resistance movement. We tend to picture a group hiding somewhere, planning attacks, recruiting members, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But that's not really how Mayday operates. What makes Mayday dangerous is that it doesn't seem to have one center. It doesn't appear to have one obvious leader. It doesn't rely on one location. Instead, it exists in pieces, small pieces, pieces that are difficult to find, pieces that are difficult to destroy. And that creates a nightmare scenario for any government. Because if you don't know where your enemy is, you don't know how to stop them. Every time Gilead removes one threat, another appears somewhere else. Every time they tighten control in one area, resistance emerges in another. It's like trying to catch smoke. And honestly, I think Gilead understands this. Because if Mayday were truly insignificant, Gilead wouldn't spend so much time worrying about them. Authoritarian governments don't become obsessed with harmless groups. They become obsessed with threats, real threats. The kind of threats that can actually weaken the system. And the fact that Mayday continues to exist after all these years suggests something important. Gilead has never fully defeated them, not even close. But here's where things become really interesting. What's fascinating is that Gilead's biggest vulnerability may not be its enemies. It may be its own leadership, because the more powerful a system becomes, the more damage an insider can do. And Lydia is perhaps the ultimate insider. But she's not the only reason I think Mayday is closer to success than people realize. The next generation might be an even bigger problem. Look at Agnes. For most of her life, Agnes accepted the world around her. Not because she was stupid, because that's the world she was raised in. It's what she knew. It's what she was taught. It's what she was expected to believe. But throughout Season 1, that certainty starts cracking. And that's important. Because authoritarian systems rely on certainty. They rely on people accepting the official story. The moment people start asking questions, things become harder to control. Agnes is starting to ask questions. She's starting to see things differently. She's starting to realize that the reality around her may not be as simple as she was taught. And once that process begins, it's difficult to stop. People rarely go back to unquestioning belief after they've started seeing contradictions. The same thing applies to other young characters. Again and again, Season 1 shows us younger people encountering information that doesn't fit neatly into Gilead's version of reality. And every time that happens, the system loses a little more control, because information is dangerous. In fact, I would argue that information is the one thing Gilead fears most. Think about how much effort the regime spends controlling knowledge, controlling education, controlling history, controlling books, controlling what people see, what people hear, what people learn. That's not accidental. It's survival. Because the moment people understand how much of the system is built on manipulation, the system starts becoming weaker. That's why the information being collected by people like Aunt Lydia matters so much. Those documents aren't just records. They're evidence. Evidence that the people running Gilead don't necessarily follow the rules they impose on everyone else. Evidence that corruption exists. Evidence that power often matters more than ideology. And that's where things become dangerous for Gilead. Because authoritarian systems depend heavily on image. They need people to believe they are strong. They need people to believe they are justified. They need people to believe they are legitimate. The moment that image begins falling apart, everything becomes harder. And honestly, I think that's what Mayday understands better than anyone. Mayday doesn't necessarily need to defeat Gilead militarily. It may only need to expose it. What if the goal was never to outfight Gilead? What if the goal was simply to reveal what Gilead really is? Because once people start seeing the gap between propaganda and reality, loyalty becomes much harder to maintain. And Season 1 is full of those gaps. Gilead talks about morality, yet powerful men repeatedly abuse their authority. Gilead talks about protecting women, yet women continue losing freedom and autonomy. Gilead talks about family values, yet families are constantly separated. Gilead talks about virtue, yet corruption appears everywhere. The more you look, the more contradictions you find. And eventually, those contradictions become impossible to ignore. That's why I think Mayday's plan may be far more sophisticated than people realize. It's not just fighting the regime. It's exposing the regime. It's forcing people to confront realities that Gilead would rather keep hidden. And once enough people start seeing those realities, change becomes possible. Now here's where my theory becomes even more interesting. What if Season 2 isn't really about building resistance? What if it's about revealing how much resistance already exists? Because when you step back and look at everything we've seen, there are signs everywhere. There are people questioning authority, people keeping secrets, people hiding information, people living double lives, people pretending to support the system while quietly working against it. And that's a dangerous situation for any government, because eventually, it becomes impossible to know who is truly loyal. Imagine being a commander. Imagine trying to protect Gilead while knowing that enemies could be anywhere. Inside schools, inside homes, inside government offices, inside religious institutions, even inside the leadership itself. That's not just a security problem. That's paranoia, and paranoia has destroyed countless regimes throughout history. The more leaders fear hidden enemies, the more mistakes they make. The more control they try to impose, the more suspicion spreads. Eventually, the system starts damaging itself. And honestly, that's exactly what I think we're beginning to see. The signs aren't dramatic. Not yet. The buildings are still standing. The uniforms are still there. The ceremonies are still happening. The laws still exist. From the outside, Gilead still looks powerful. But power and stability aren't the same thing. That's something history teaches us over and over again. Some of the strongest looking systems collapse surprisingly fast once the cracks become visible. Not because they suddenly became weak, because they were weaker than people realized. The warning signs were already there. People just didn't notice them. And that's what makes the Testament so fascinating to me. The story isn't simply asking whether Gilead can survive external threats. It's asking whether Gilead can survive itself. Because when you look closely, many of its biggest problems come from within. Its hypocrisy, its corruption, its obsession with control, its inability to adapt, its growing disconnect from the people it claims to represent. Those things create vulnerabilities, and Mayday seems to understand exactly how to exploit them. That's why I keep coming back to the same conclusion. Mayday's greatest victory may not be a future event. It may already be happening, not through a battle, not through an invasion, not through some dramatic military operation, through ideas, through information, through doubt, through people beginning to question the world around them. Because once enough people stop believing in the story starts falling apart. And maybe that's the real significance of Season 1. Maybe the season wasn't showing us the rise of a resistance. Maybe it was showing us the moment that resistance became impossible to stop. Because when I look at Agnes, Daisy, Aunt Lydia, and everything happening around them, I don't see a regime becoming stronger. I see a regime becoming increasingly fragile, a regime that still looks powerful on the surface, but one that's slowly losing control underneath. And if that's true, then Season 2 could be far bigger than people realize. Because the question may no longer be whether Mayday can hurt Gilead. The question may be whether Gilead can survive Mayday's plan at all. And if Season 1 taught us anything, it's that some enemies don't attack a wall from the outside. Sometimes they convince the wall to collapse from within. And honestly, I think that's exactly what Mayday has been doing all along.